It is Thursday, March 28th, 2019. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me today at Dentons' Atlanta office is Mr. Sam Olens. Mr. Olens is currently counsel at Dentons' Public Policy Practice and a member of the firm's State Attorneys General group here in Atlanta. Mr. Olens served as a member of the Cobb County Commission from 1999 until 2002. He was elected chairman of the Cobb County Commission in August 2002 and held that position until 2010. Mr. Olens was elected Attorney General of Georgia in November 2010 and was reelected to that position in 2014 before resigning in 2016 to become president of Kennesaw State University, a position he held until last year. Thank you very much, Mr. Olens, for taking some time this morning to talk Georgia politics with me.
My pleasure.
I really do appreciate it. And I wonder if we could just get started by talking about your childhood and your upbringing. You were born in Miami, but grew up, as we talked about earlier, in New Jersey.
Yeah, my mom died when I was 5, so we moved to South Jersey, an area that would be very unknown to most Southerners. By that I mean when they think of New Jersey, they think of North Jersey. I was raised near Cape May, near Delaware. It was predominantly chickens, corn, tomatoes, and lettuce.
Definitely not what I think of.
No, very agrarian. Many more chickens than Gainesville. And very safe environment, very rural environment. If we at age 15 got a learner's permit and got in trouble, we went into a farm field. My dad died when I was 12, then raised by aunt and uncle. My uncle died when I was 14, and upon graduation from high school, went to American University for 2 degrees, and then went to Emory University for law school.
What drew you to American and D.C.?
So that's really interesting because rural, and then I studied international affairs at the School of International Service at the American University. Yeah. So I was always just very interested in world events, even though there really weren't any in the community where I was raised. In fact, the majority of students, if they graduated from high school, certainly did not go to college. I spent one summer working in a chicken plant. I spent one summer working at a glass factory. I was absolutely going to college. And, the people were very nice. It was a very diverse ethnic community. We had food festivals all the time. I loved Sundays because the smell of pasta was everywhere, and I'd go visit a friend, so I would just happen to get a really good dinner after church on Sunday.
So what was Washington, D.C. like in the I guess this would be probably the late 70s or so?
So the second year I was there was the fall of the embassy in Iran.
Okay.
So that sort of predominated. The other issue in D.C. then was frankly the hogs and the Washington Redskins. It was the only thing that got people in Washington to think about something other than politics. They didn't have a baseball team at the time.
Right.
The Capitals hockey team was terrible. You went to the arena, so you saw either the Philadelphia or New York hockey teams. But it was a nice change of pace. Everyone would think about football, especially the Redskins and Dallas. So it was a fascinating time, all the embassies, all the international events, and a lot was occurring in foreign policy. Jimmy Carter was the president. Clearly, it was a time of much confusion, much change. The role of America seen very differently throughout the world. So it was a great time to get both a bachelor's and master's in international affairs.
So, as you just said, you got a master's. Was that something you were planning, a career in international affairs, foreign policy? Because obviously we know you ended up in law school. Why did you pursue that instead of law school directly?
So I had at least 1 year of PhD courses.
Okay.
I had applied to the PhD program at American U, got into the PhD program at Penn, got into law school at American U and Emory. I had a sister living in Atlanta, and she convinced me to go to law school down here.
So what kind of law were you interested in studying or pursuing?
So I thought I was first going to be interested in international law.
Right.
The summer of my last year of law school, I met my wife for the last 31 years, so that altered that plan. And Emory University was one of the first law schools in the country to adopt the NITA program, which was the National Institute of Trial Advocacy. I really enjoyed trial. So upon graduation from law school, I went to work with a firm where I immediately started trying cases, both federal court and state court. And up until being chair of both the Cobb Commission and the Atlanta Regional Commission, I regularly tried cases all the time.
So the firm you started working with, was this in Atlanta, or was
Yes.
this a Cobb County firm?
Actually, it was the old Equitable building a couple blocks from here. Then when I was elected county commissioner, we moved really in between Marietta and downtown, near OK Cafe, West Paces and 41. But when I added the chairmanship of the Atlanta Regional Commission, it then meant that I had public meetings every week. The trials I was involved in generally would last 1 to 3 weeks. There was no way around that.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about Cobb County,
Sure.
and then tell me about Cobb County that you remember when you settled there back in the 1980s.
So many people moved to Cobb County then due to the excellent school systems. One of the things I learned really quickly in local government is people care less about the mayor and council or the commissioners than they do about the school board. That's their primary issue. Secondly, of course, is public safety.
Right.
Everything else is way below. But education and public safety are the dominant factors. Cobb County had an excellent school system. And my wife, in fact, told me point blank we were moving to Cobb County. And like a good husband, I said, yes, dear. And Cobb County does have an excellent program through the state. But that's really, I think, the dominant reason you move to a community is you want to be in the neighborhood schools.
So how did you get involved in the East Cobb Civic Association?
So at that time, there was a lot of growth
Right.
in East Cobb. And there was a time where developers seemed to get acceptance with whatever they threw before the county commission. We called them at that time postage size lots, 7,000 square foot lots. And I took the position that that was just added profit, and that developers could make plenty of money building developments with larger size lots and in fact create a better family experience. By family experience, I mean you got the swim, you got the tennis courts, you have the ability to be active within one's community.
Right.
The county at that time really didn't have many city centers. Cities thereafter have really become experts in that area. Counties are now following. So we were really interested in creating a center for East Cobb, which ended up becoming East Cobb Park. And similarly, I was concerned about overdevelopment in the community. I learned really quickly when we moved into the subdivision that if you're a banker, a CPA, you own a small business, or you're a lawyer and you make the mistake to go to an annual homeowners meeting, they call you board member. So I came back from that first meeting, a board member, got to tell my wife that when I returned. Said, this is your fault. You told me to go. And as I got more involved, I decided that I was going to run against the incumbent commissioner. My slogan was homeowners first, because I firmly believed that you could be pro-business and pro-development for residents at the same time, that they weren't counterproductive. And my predecessor had a vindictive reputation within the business community. So they were scared to give me checks that would show up on reports. But at the time, if you wrote a check for $100 or less, your name did not need to be listed under Georgia law.
Right.
So let's just say I had a lot of $100 checks. 5 of us ran, the incumbent and 4 opponents. I was fortunate to come in second. Mm-hmm. The other 3 promptly endorsed me in the runoff, and the nastier the incumbent got, the more support I got. The night of the election, and I'm happy to say I never had a negative run campaign. I never went after my opponent. It was always about why you should support me, not the opponent.
Right.
The night of the campaign, pretty early on, the local newspaper called me and said, Sam, you're going to be the new commissioner. And I said, there's like 7% voted. How could you possibly say that? And he said, well, you just trounced the incumbent in his home precinct.
It's a good indication.
And I said, well, that's positive, but let's still wait for a little bit more. But it was like a 2-to-1 in the runoff. He did something that was novel. We had a question at a panel about whether or not you should have another option for the school district when the local school was overcrowded. And I had suggested that if there was another close school, it was for the betterment of the school system to permit that. Well, my opponent chose to go on TV, cable at that time, and mailers saying that I wanted to force families in East Cobb to go to schools in South Cobb. I never knew that. So it had both a racist overtone as well as a, in general, fear factor. Mm-hmm. Johnny Isaacson, a congressman at the time, said, look, it's not my position to get involved in other races, but clearly that is not an accurate statement. And the school system at that time said the same thing, and they said, we don't get involved in other races, but that is not what we're considering, and what the incumbent is saying is totally to scare people and inappropriate.
You haven't named your opponent, but I will. This was the race against Gordon Wysong.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned property owner rights, things like that, opposition to certain sort of developments. Did his position, his very vocal public position on the homosexuality not a referendum, but a
the gay resolution.
Excuse me. Thank you. Did that have any influence on driving you to challenge him?
It did, but that alone would not have been a winning campaign.
Sure. So it was a combination of factors.
See, I personally have the position that I think is very libertarian, that government should not be dictating what other people do, and that one's personal positions are theirs and theirs alone and stay out of their lives. Mm-hmm. So I did not see it as the role of government to be involved at all in social issues like that. Treat everyone fairly, the old golden rule.
Right. So you were described in some of the local media as that you were the strong neighborhoods advocate on the commission.
True.
What do you think they meant by that?
Well, they meant that that was my base. I mean, let's face it, the more he went on TV blasting me, or the more mailers, we were going to the copy stores at that time and printing flyers and having homeowner leaders put on each flyer, I support Sam. And then they would sign their name in the subdivision. On a weekend, we would get out like 6,000, 7,000 flyers in neighborhoods. So it was not, I didn't have money for mailers, but I had money to print paper.
Right.
And these folks would come to our house. It was very grassroots. They had 100 houses in their subdivision. We gave them 100 sheets of paper. they would walk the neighborhood. And it was very successful. The other issue that we haven't talked about that I don't generally talk about a lot is I'm Jewish.
Right.
And several reporters left no opportunity to say that. But it was very interesting because the folks in Cobb, vast majority, never cared what religion I was. So even though the press would generally cover it, it never had traction, thankfully. And I always had a very good rapport, and still do through the state, with the full religious community in Cobb County, and always supported the religious leaders in the county. So as much as a small minority of folks would try and raise an issue, never caught on.
Do you think that the issue is raised, at least by journalists and reporters, malcontents aside, because of Cobb County's legacy of Leo Frank, of friction with the Atlanta Jewish community? I
assume, but I actually ran into more issues statewide than I ever did in Cobb. Also, for instance, it's really funny. There was the longtime minister of Roswell Street Baptist, Nelson Price. The morning after the election, he called my house at 7 a.m. And it's actually a sort of funny story. At the time, my wife liked Pepsi One. Pepsi One is no longer available. She now loves Coke Zero. I get a call 7 a.m. from Reverend Price going, "Sam, we're thrilled you won. And we're really thrilled that the picture on the cover of the Marietta Daily Journal has you with a soda." I said, "Reverend Price, it's a Pepsi." He goes, "Sam, it's not liquor. I love the picture." And I'm going, I'm going to take holy hell that my wife likes Pepsi One and it's in the picture. So I always had a very good rapport. I spent a lot of time, incidentally, both as a commissioner and chair with minority places of worship. I think some of us understood very early on about the necessary outreach for local government with all communities and the need for everyone to feel safe and included within the affairs of that community. So, for instance, when I left Cobb County, over half of my appointments were minority residents of the county. I felt that was very, very important to send that message.
You running your campaign for District 3, I guess, was East Cobb.
Yes.
Tell me about the different demographics, the different political beliefs. When people think Cobb County, they just have this suburban Atlanta. But Cobb's very diverse in beliefs, in issues that people find important. East Cobb, West Cobb, South Cobb's already been mentioned, Marietta, Smyrna. Can you tell me a little bit about how that breaks down and how that informs the way the commission governs the county?
Less than you would think. People are people. It makes no difference whether they live in West Cobb or whether they live in Lanier County. They want a positive, optimistic future for their children. So I learned that in Cobb, and I learned that running statewide. At the end of the day, they want their children to have a better life than they have. So yes, there are always extremists on both sides of the political spectrum, and yes, they get more play than they should. But at the end of the day, it's all about the future for our residents. So it was interesting. One day, I went out to West Cobb when I was the East Cobb commissioner because they kept telling me they were very much against 1/3 acre subdivisions. I live in a 1/3 acre subdivision. And I think if you show someone a subdivision where they don't live, and you say, okay, is that 1/3 or 1/2 of an acre? 90% of people would have absolutely no clue. But what I learned in West Cobb was, at that time, the 1/3 acre subdivisions had one side brick or stucco, and 3 sides really cheap siding.
I know the style well.
Okay, and in East Cobb, it was generally 3 sides, brick or stucco, and 1 side, meaning the rear, cheap siding. So when they were talking to me about 1/3 versus 1/2 acre subdivision lots, they were really talking quality of construction. So that was one of the things I learned really early on was you want to live in a house that's built well. And oh, by the way, I had some of that Chinese siding that I needed to replace, like many other folks.
It's a blast from the past.
So it, paid the price for that.
Right. So other than development and growth, well, growth is separate. Other than developments and subdivisions, what were the issues that consumed the commission during your time, either as member or chairman?
Thankfully, the county still AAA for credit rating. One of about 30 counties in the country. Gwinnett having been AAA right after us, I think a year apart. So clearly county finances have always been very important, and public safety. A lot of pride in having very well-trained public safety officials. Also water and wastewater. It was funny, so here I had these 2 degrees in international politics, and I learned a lot about poverty. I learned a lot about disease from bad water. And here I'm going to meeting after meeting talking about water and wastewater. Infrastructure is so vital. So other than development, the issues were really public safety, economics, and infrastructure. And that gave me a great broad scope to thereafter work on statewide issues.
Speaking of infrastructure, transportation is and will be a consummate issue for Metro Atlanta. What were the challenges facing Cobb County then in the 1990s, early 2000s, and how has that changed?
It hasn't. The more people come, you repeat. And there's a rule in transportation called the law of triple convergence. And in essence, when you widen a road, more people start using the road, so the road it's open is the day that it's congested. One of the things I learned incidentally was it's far cheaper and often more effective to do things like turn lanes. Because if you're waiting in line for a car to turn left, but there's a turn lane for left turning traffic, it's a lot cheaper, a lot less right away, a lot less cost, and you make a huge improvement to the community. The other issue over time with millennials is they're much more interested in transit, and the high-tech companies are much more interested in moving to areas with transit. So if you want the best and the brightest, the creative classes it was called decades ago, if you want them to move into your community, you need to be working on transit, or you're losing big time.
Well, this is jumping ahead quite a bit. There was just a referendum in Gwinnett County, just on the other side of Atlanta, that failed by, I would say, a surprisingly large margin.
It's about 6%.
Why do you think it failed?
Well, clearly, 2 things happened. One, turnout was not nearly as high as a general election.
Right. This is a March special.
Right. And 2, the vocal opposition gets the press, which further discourages turnout.
Right.
Commission Chairwoman Charlotte Nash, in my opinion, is by far the best local elected official in the region. If you scored a 0 to 100, I'm giving her 100. She previously was a county administrator, previously was CFO. She has all the tools for success. But the decision to have a 5-0 vote, to have the MARTA vote, as compared to a split vote, was neither right or wrong, but it did provide an election with less turnout.
Right.
If that election is held again next November, I expect it will pass.
Right. I mean, I think the final turnout numbers were something fewer than 100,000
right.
turned out for that election.
And incidentally, she made a great deal with MARTA. 29 cents went to operations. DeKalb and Fulton pay 50.
That's a major but that message, you would argue, got lost compared to the simply, I guess the chief argument was that the same as the chief argument in Cobb County and Gwinnett in the 60s and 70s was that those suburban Atlantans would be paying for the city to be the cash cow, I think was one of the quotes.
So when I chaired the Atlanta Regional Commission, I worked really well with Shirley Franklin, who at the time was the mayor of Atlanta. And in fact, we brought forward an initiative called Concept 3 to determine where future transit needed to be built in the region. To this day, the plan is called Concept 3 and emanates from that process, and it's now within what's called the ATL.
Mm-hmm.
So I take a lot of pride in that. Shirley and I work together on a lot of issues to reduce that foolish discussion of the suburbs against the city of Atlanta.
Right.
And I would tell you once again with Chairwoman Nash, her discussions with Robbie Ash, who at the time chaired the MARTA board, similarly did a lot to reduce that friction. It is only when the suburbs and the city of Atlanta work positively together that our region can fully succeed.
Why did you decide to run for chairman of the commission
in
2002?
The chairman announced he was going to resign to run for governor.
And this is Bill Byrne.
Bill Byrne. He ended up coming in third place in the Republican primary. When he made the announcement he was running for chair, numerous folks went up to my wife and I if I was interested, if I would consider. And to my amazement, my wife said yes. I didn't count on that. And I ran. And it was a great experience. I have a lot of great memories of having had that opportunity. I have no interest in ever running for political office again. For several reasons. What used to be considered evil before is nothing compared to the current climate in politics. But I had great experiences throughout.
How did your approach to leading the commission differ from your predecessors, if at all?
So I used to affectionately say that I walked the halls all the time. I spent time with all the district commissioners. I spent time with all of the department heads. That's how you get a buy-in. You're not supposed to agree with everyone all the time, but you need to show that you respect them and that you listen to them. I would say, for instance, that the Gwinnett chairwoman does the same thing. That time that you spend with your fellow elected officials is more than worth it to have everyone predominantly in the same direction.
Mm-hmm. So you were reelected chair right in the midst of the Great Recession.
Well, I was elected 3 times.
3 times.
Yes.
So this would have been the
So
third.
the third time I had no opponent.
Okay.
The second time I had a gadfly that got 18%.
Gadfly is a term that is not used enough, and I appreciate that you do use it.
Well, he had one public comment that was priceless. He came in with a globe. He put a $sign. He put religious symbols. And he pretty much insulted everyone that you could possibly do within that 5-minute discussion.
It's an amazing approach to campaigning.
Absolutely. People would say, well, you could stop him if you want because he's talking politics. And I'm going, he's doing perfectly fine.
Please proceed.
Please give him his 5 minutes. And the third time, I was just simply blessed where I didn't have an opponent at all.
So when, you've already mentioned the AAA bond rating. Did the recession affect Cobb County like other places in Georgia, and how so?
You immediately needed to reduce the expenditures because the revenues weren't coming in. You had a significant hit in home values, all property values. We had already reduced the budget once before I resigned to run for Attorney General. Unfortunately, the county chose not to do that a second time until after a new chairperson had been elected, and that really put them further behind the 8 ball in keeping up with the depth of the recession.
Right. Did the recession and dealing with the recession, did that have any bearing on your decision to enter the Attorney General's race?
No one, frankly, appreciated that time how large a recession we were coming into. Keep in mind the last couple of recessions nationally did not really adversely affect the Southeast as it did, for instance, the Northeast and Midwest.
Right. The 03 and early 90s.
The issue which actually got me in a little trouble in the campaign was I actually wanted a challenge. After 12 years of zoning meetings and being involved in local government, the problems became the norm rather than complex, and I missed law. I missed not being more involved in numerous legal issues. My opponent on the Democratic side actually said he was bored. He's running for Attorney General because he was bored. Well, that was true. But I look upon my time with the commission with much appreciation. The county employees are fantastic. The folks I worked with did a great job. The perception is that government workers don't work hard. The folks I worked with worked very hard and were great stewards of the public funds and tried very hard to go beyond expectations on a daily basis and accomplish that. But I felt that I wasn't being personally challenged.
So running for the nomination for a statewide office,
right?
The politics of the party and everything. What had your experience been with the Republican Party up to that point?
So I knew the leadership. I knew the leaders of the urban areas far more than I knew the rural leaders. But keep in mind, again, I grew up in a rural area, so that helped me. But I had a lot of catching up to do. It's one of the reasons I resigned when I did, because I knew I needed to go throughout the state of Georgia and earn friends.
So how did you, a commissioner from East Cobb, sell yourself to rural Republicans, either in North Georgia, South Georgia, and all points in between?
So Cobb County has a reputation of excellence, of providing great service for low millage. You make a lot of friends leading a government that treats the taxpayers' monies well, that's conservative with their dollars.
What were the issues that were front and center in that 2009-2010 campaign season?
Number one was the Affordable Care Act. When I made the decision to run, that was not front and center, but it became front and center.
Sure.
Which unfortunately actually led me to why I wanted to resign after my second term, because the position, to a large degree, switched from being the state's lawyer to a hyper-partisan office, which I did not like. I wanted to be the state's lawyer. When I heard some of my colleagues say, I wake up every day wanting to sue President Obama, whether I agreed or disagreed with President Obama on issues, I wanted to be the state's lawyer. And now when I hear folks from the other political parties say I wake up every day wanting to sue President Trump, that's just as wrong. You know, you weren't elected to be hyperpartisan. You were elected to do the job as described in the state constitution and statutes. So a lot of it was literally water, the water wars.
Sure.
A lot of it was, frankly, providing some assistance throughout the state. Sheriffs in particular would go up to me and say, we at times don't really understand the state law. Would you help us? We're not asking you to support our position, but will you give us the time to discuss it? Mm-hmm. And I agreed I would, and we did. And that still occurs to date. We started a policy where if the lawyer representing the elected official would send us a memo on stating that they were unsure about a state law, they felt the answer to their question was X, would we review it? We would then tell them either A, you're right, you're wrong, or the state law sufficiently ambiguous, there isn't a clear answer. And that frankly made a lot of friends to have
Sure.
that relationship with local government.
Were those sort of advisory opinions, were those uncommon before? Or
They had not occurred before.
Really? Interesting.
You know, because it's dangerous. You know, you represent the executive branch.
Sure.
You don't represent legislative or judicial, and you don't represent local government. But I felt that if we had the expertise in-house, it was appropriate for us to assist local government, just like it was appropriate at times to assist legislative and judicial.
Were ethics front and center when you were running, or is that an issue that emerged and evolved?
That evolved.
How so?
Well, the whole idea of the old ethics commission and now the new name transparency, et cetera, et cetera. Look, it's not that the problems didn't pre-exist. It's that the press didn't, frankly, sufficiently emphasize the concerns. Mm-hmm. I personally still think there should be more expressed in that area. And I think the press at times gets it wrong. I'll give you an example. If someone is a blueberry farmer and they seek to pass a law in the Georgia legislature that affects blueberry farmers, that's transparent. I know it. When someone in the legislature is a consultant for an industry and that isn't disclosed because it's not required to be disclosed, and they seek to pass a law that would help someone who's writing them a check as a consultant, that's the problem. Mm. In many states, laws prohibit such conduct. We need that law here.
What's preventing it from being enacted here in Georgia, and why is Georgia an outlier in that regard?
Well, I didn't say it's an outlier. There's plenty of states like Georgia. It's the same answer as why the sunshine laws don't affect the legislative branch, only the executive branch statewide and then local governments. Those that pass the laws generally want the laws in their favor.
Mm-hmm. I think the most high-profile role that many people know you from is you had a speaking slot at the 2012 Republican National Convention.
Yes, sir.
You spoke along with Pam Bondi, correct?
Yes, the Florida AG.
How did that come about? How did the Attorney General from Georgia get a prime speaking slot at the RNC down in Tampa?
Because the Attorney General from Georgia 4 years earlier had been very supportive of candidate Romney and led the state committee 4 years later for candidate Romney. I think in life, seldom do you meet a candidate that is brighter and sharper and more willing to do what's right than Mitt Romney. I'll make another comment to just put it all out there. I've never met a Georgia politician that is anywhere close to the statesman Johnny Isakson is. So he has clearly been an unofficial mentor for me within our state. And when I look at the folks that were running for president, I didn't think anyone had the integrity of Mitt Romney both of those elections. So clearly my time supporting candidate Romney had a lot to do with that choice.
Sure. So that would have been middle of your first term.
Yes.
Was it 2013, 2014, 2015? Okay, so in 2015, after your reelection, a series of Supreme Court decisions are handed down, one of the most prominent ones being the Obergefell decision.
Right.
Striking down prohibitions of same-sex marriage.
Right.
What was your anticipation leading up to that decision, and then your guidance during
So it's actually
that period?
very interesting. A month before the decision came out, clearly that was a decision that was going to come out the last couple of days of June.
Sure.
Because that's the way the most controversial cases occur.
How
in the
they do
Supreme Court.
things.
So I did a talk to the Atlanta Press Club about a month before, and I talked about the office and what was occurring in the office. And then I opened it up for Q&A. The very first question was, is Georgia going to comply with the Supreme Court's decision if they find that state statute or constitutional provisions on same-sex marriages are unconstitutional? My answer was yes, that's what lawyers do. Next question, will I help state agencies or direct state agencies and local governments, i.e. probate judges, to comply? Answer, yes, that's what the state attorney general's office should do. Before I could get back to the office, the national press was all about, once again, Georgia's not like Alabama, and the attorney general will follow the law. What was interesting was my good friend, who was the attorney general of Alabama, had said the same thing. But the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, Roy Moore, had a different opinion. So I really felt bad about that and actually called my colleague in Alabama, because I never said anything about Alabama. That was the press that made that link. And he had openly told folks, we will comply with the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, unlike the Chief Justice of their court at the time. The next day, Dennis O'Hare ran into Governor Deal. And he said, Governor, did you hear that the Attorney General said that Georgia would follow whatever the decision was of the U.S. Supreme Court? And Governor Deal said, yes, that's what lawyers are supposed to do, and that's what our state will do. I agree with the Attorney General. Once again, that made national news. When the decision came out, the first thing we did, of course, was thoroughly read the opinion. Within 3 hours of the decision, we issued a memo to all state and local agencies telling them what the decision said and that they had an obligation to strictly comply with that decision. The probate judge of Cobb County, Chase Daughtry at the time, was the head of the probate council. And the two of us tag teamed to make sure that any judges that were not promptly following the Supreme Court's direction were immediately directed to do so. And we worked really well as a team. I would say that next week, I would regularly get calls from some interested parties telling me, the probate judge of X county will not do marriages, or, incidentally, Cobb County did marriages that day.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really proud of my home county in that regard. And within a week, pretty much all the probate judges and state agencies were fully compliant with the law. So I think Georgia, once again, did what was right in that regard. You still had some folks that disliked the fact that I defended the state law. But candidly, that was the job of the Attorney General. I very much disagree with some of the state attorneys general that choose to defy laws when they think it is not in their political interest. Mm-hmm. You have an obligation to defend state law by definition, unless it is so blatantly unconstitutional that it would be wrong to do that. So, for instance, the Georgia legislature, it was funny, when I ran for re-election, one of the questions at the GPB debate was, can you list any times where you disagreed with your party? And I said, well, how many examples do you want? And they sort of looked at me, and I said, well, for instance, when the legislature passed a law that the state could require blood tests before welfare benefits were distributed, the governor and I talked and decided that would not come into law in our state. Mm-hmm. Because we were not turning down the $3 billion in welfare benefits for the citizen of our state, and that we were going to be fully compliant with a federal law.
Right.
So there were numerous times where I, in working with the governor, made sure that Georgia was not going to be was not going to be sued by the Department of Justice in a case we had no chance of winning.
Right.
There are other suits that you take on because you've got a good legal argument, a fair legal argument. Where you have no legal argument, don't embarrass yourself.
Was this the same kind of thinking that led you to speak out about, there was executive order on Syrian refugee settlement?
Yes.
And the religious the RFRA bill,
right?
That is still being debated, I suppose. Well, not anymore, but was that the same thinking that its face?
The Syrian refugee issue was the same exact mm-hmm. issue. By definition, immigration is referenced in the Constitution. Right. It's a national issue. Mm-hmm. And I got blasted on the talk shows, mm-hmm. but once again, the job of Attorney General is not to be a partisan hack.
So you've already discussed at length, I believe, with my friend and mentor Tom Scott from Kennesaw State about your
yes.
time at Kennesaw. But is this what we've been talking about? Sort of the growing partisanship, the friction between politics and policy and law. Is that what led you to step down from
yes.
your position as Attorney General and enter
yes.
academia?
Yes. Because I had been a previously elected Republican, the College of Humanities felt that I was evil. And there was nothing I was going to say that was going to change that opinion from many, not all, but many. So for instance, one thing that was very interesting, so as Cobb Commissioner and Chair, I was very active in the arts, very supportive of the arts.
Sure.
While I was there, we actually worked with the Gallery Authority to build the Cobb Energy Performing Arts Center. Mm-hmm. While president of KSU, we were very active in improving the arts programs within the College of the Arts. And even though for many at the university it was hard to imagine a former elected Republican supporting the arts, I never understood that argument. The arts make us all better. And by the way, there's a lot of research that says that the arts also make us brighter, better students. Mm-hmm. But I got to the point that there was a fight to fight, and there wasn't a win mm-hmm. in sight.
It sounds like a common thread that runs through your career is that if you're not going to win the fight, then you're not going to fight it just to...
No, move on to other challenges where you can make a difference.
Well, speaking of which, what is your line of work here at Dentons, here at the law firm? What are you involved in?
The majority of it's economic development, which of course is very fitting with my 12 years in local government. I do work in the Attorney General space. I do represent companies that need to be active in those issues, whether they're antitrust, consumer protection. Those are the main two areas. I represent a couple governments now, and I work with governments on behalf of clients in that regard. And then I still spend a good amount of time, frankly, on helping the community. I had a call right before this where we were raising money for a nonprofit. Once again, I learned that from John A. Isaacson. The business community and the nonprofit community need to work together for the betterment of the citizens. So I spend a good amount of my time trying to make the nonprofit community stronger.
Does your current work get you back in the courtroom?
So I was in the courtroom 2 months ago. So once in a while I get in the courtroom. And I enjoy it. I like it. It's sort of like some people would be scared to ever go in the courtroom and they'd rather just do transaction law. I like the personal interaction.
Not so unlike a fellow Cobb County and Governor Barnes, who still enjoys the courtroom and the give and take.
He was in the courtroom the prior week in Henry County. I actually had a telephone call with Governor Barnes yesterday with regard to some nonprofit issues. He similarly does a lot for the nonprofit community, and he fully appreciates that supporting the nonprofit community is a nonpartisan issue. And I greatly appreciate his leadership in that area.
Well, let's zoom out a bit since Governor Barnes came up. You were active in politics during that period of rapid transformation of the state's politics from a Democratic state to a Republican stronghold. Right. Why do you think the Democratic Party of Georgia was able to hold on to power for so long here in the state?
Well, of course, you had that overtly unconstitutional practice, one vote, one county.
Sure, the county, yes.
Right. I think part of it was, and the opposite is happening now, for many people more in the middle, they vote in the primary where they expect the winner to come from. So it wasn't until Governor Perdue ran as a new Republican,
right,
that many conservative Democrats, especially from South Georgia, took a Republican ballot and then supported him in the general election. Now there are many suburban women in the last election that voted Democrat that for years were voting Republican.
Right.
So I think it's the many in the middle that you always want to vote for the winner. You want to support the baseball team that's apt to do well during the season.
Sure.
So, Governor Perdue's election changed a lot of votes from D to R. And I think the last election similarly changed a lot of votes from R to D.
Well, why do you think that is? That the Republican consolidation went so rapidly from Democrats controlling everything in 2000 up to the 2002 election to Republicans controlling every statewide office, both houses of the legislature and the governor's mansion by 2010.
I think national politics have an awful lot to do with it. And when you're displeased with what you perceive to be the national direction,
Mm-hmm.
you easiest have that ability to show your frustration at the local level.
Do you see any discrepancies between the way Democratic governments or Democratic administrations govern the state as opposed to the Republican administrations of Sonny Perdue, Nathan Deal? Like, what are the difference in priorities or maybe styles?
Candidly, I think far less than imagined. Governor Barnes sincerely felt what he was doing was right for the state's education system, just as Governor Perdue thought what he was doing and what Governor Deal was doing was right. I think in a conservative area, I'm not saying R&D, I'm saying conservative, predominant conservative, good government, good education, being a good steward of the state's finances, they don't really change between the two parties per se. There's clearly the extremes of both parties where you have those changes. And what we're seeing, for instance, in Georgia is really a heightening of the issue between the social conservatives and the business conservatives. Just as you're seeing in the other party the difference between the social justice section of the party and the business section of that party. It's not to say one side's wrong or right from either party, but you're seeing that stress, keeping the tent together. But the Republican district attorney wants to get bad guys off the street, just as the Democrat district attorney wants to get bad guys off the street. The Democrat sheriff is doing the same job as the Republican sheriff. Now, you may have some differences where the Democrat DA may not want to be taking the small drug case, and there still may be several Republican DAs that will. But I think in general the differences are few in that regard. Look at how many people, when Governor Perdue ran for office, switched parties. Their politics really didn't change. They just took a different ballot.
Well, what do you think the biggest danger, or the greatest danger rather, facing the Republican Party's governing majority here in the state is?
The social conservative versus the business conservative. Look, if you look in today's paper, the concern is the heartbeat bill going to take away many more Republican suburban seats and turn the legislature from majority Republican to majority Democrat? That's a real concern.
Do you think the 2016 election, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, do you think that was the catalyst, or that was just simply something that drew greater attention to an existing divide within the state and within the Republican Party?
I think it was more how people viewed the prior president.
How do you mean?
Many people would argue that neither candidate was who they wanted. But the division caused from the prior president was going to lead you to strongly support one or the other.
Were you surprised that Cobb County went for Hillary Clinton? She didn't win a majority in 2016, but she did carry the county over Donald Trump.
No.
Why not?
The party's growing. The party's much more diverse. And as I mentioned, both candidates had a lot of baggage.
What do you think the long-term effects of a Donald Trump presidency is going to have on the Republican brand here in Georgia?
So I think look, 80+% of Republicans, while they may not appreciate his tweets, they appreciate his policies. You have to differentiate the two. There's overwhelming support for the president's policies within the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. Overwhelming. Many of them could do without the tweets, but they also appreciate why he does it. One would argue that mainstay of American democracy, the press, is a little too partisan at the moment, or some members are too partisan at the moment. It reminds me of George Bush's first term when he was running for re-election, George W. Bush.
Right.
Many people thought he was going to lose convincingly for re-election. And then he received a gift called John Kerry, and the election was never close. I think as we look at 2019, the November 2020 election will have more to do with who the Democrats make their candidate. Is it someone such as Elizabeth Warren, or is it someone such as Joe Biden? From a Georgia perspective, a Joe Biden will get a lot more votes than an Elizabeth Warren. So I think similar to the John Kerry candidacy, and I'm not making any negative comments on John Kerry, but it played into who people voted for. Mm-hmm. I have no doubt Elizabeth Warren is very bright. I also have no doubt Medicare for All and the cost associated with it, similar to the Green New Deal, is not one that plays well among the majority of Georgians in a national election. Do I think there's a likelihood that the Democrats once again do well in the November 2020 elections? I would expect they do.
Well, we just went through a very high-profile election last fall,
right,
for governor. I want to get your thoughts on the Republican side and the Democratic side. The conventional wisdom going into that race that it was going to be Casey Cagle versus insert Democrat. On the Republican side, that didn't happen. Walk me through how Casey Cagle went from front runner to losing so convincingly in the runoff to Secretary Brian Kemp.
Okay, so number one, I'm friends with both of them.
Sure.
I'm friends with Stacey Abrams. I like Stacey Abrams. Brian always spent much more time on the grassroots. Casey always spent much more time with the folks that would write big checks. That created a mechanism where Brian's support was implicitly stronger per each individual vote. A business person writes a check, the other person gets their friends to vote. It's the difference between a yard sign on a business and a sign on a house. The sign on the house is a vote. When the recording came out in the runoff, the election was over. It was over before President Trump's endorsement of Governor Kemp. That simply made it even a larger disparity.
Right.
But the tape itself was all that was needed to assure Governor Kemp's victory.
And on the Democratic side, Stacey Abrams and Stacey Evans from Cobb County.
And very nice lady, too.
Oh, absolutely. Two different strategies for winning the nomination.
Right. We know which one.
Right. So Stacey Abrams is sort of base-centric turnout model, and then Stacey Evans, who ran the sort of Roy Barnes, Buddy Darden,
right,
Jason Carter try to it's the middle way. Do you think Stacey Evans's strategy has a future in Georgia within the Democratic Party?
I would hope it does, but it certainly did not. And for instance, something that hasn't really been covered much. So Karen Handel's race with Lucy McBath.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There were several apartment complexes in that district that had significantly higher turnout than ever before as a result of Stacey Abrams' methodology. She frankly had a much better get out the vote campaign. We must never forget that at the end of the day, the efforts to encourage votes is much more important than nasty commercials on TV. Once again, the positive versus the negative. Mm-hmm. When folks were showing up for advance voting and for voting on the day of the election, if you remember the Romney-Obama campaign, mm-hmm. the Republicans thought they had a get out the vote program in place. It didn't work.
Was it Narwhal?
Yeah, it was a disaster, right? They couldn't even get it to work that morning.
It was
right?
a total flop on Election Day.
In contrast, the NRC had a really good program when Trump ran mm-hmm. 4 years later. You can never discount the value of that get out the vote turnout mechanism. Stacey Abrams did it. And that got a lot of other people elected even when she was not.
Right. And so we're talking about not just Karen Handel, Lucy McBath in the 6th District, but state Senate seats in Metro Atlanta.
Absolutely.
State representatives in Metro Atlanta.
Absolutely.
The suburban and metropolitan Atlanta, originally the core of Republicanism in Georgia.
Right.
Mac Mattingly would not have been elected senator were it not for Cobb County.
Right.
And its 79% Republican vote. Has now voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 and by a majority for mm-hmm. Stacey Abrams, and the same with Gwinnett, Henry County. What's driving suburban voters to the Democratic side?
So it's more suburban women, but not exclusively suburban women. I think a lot of it is, once again, that libertarian issue of governments getting too intrusive. Once again, the heartbeat bill. The RFRA bill. It's less and less the candidate and more the party, which I think is very unfortunate. I'd like to see it more and more the candidate and less the party, but that's not where we're headed at the moment. I think that let's face it, many people are in that middle. The party that encourages their support is the winner. The speaker before the session specifically encouraged the legislature to not get involved in a lot of the social issues that would hurt suburban Republicans next November.
It doesn't seem that they heeded Speaker Ralston's advice.
And in some ways, yes. In some ways, no. The State House and the State Democrat are on some very different pages at the moment. And that will continue mm-hmm. on some of these issues. And in some ways, it's very, interesting. Atlanta airport bill, stronger in the Senate than the House. The THC oil, stronger in the House than the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes for some interesting discussion for dissertations.
Mm-hmm. We talked about the suburbs, and Stacey Abrams also boosted Democratic turnout in cities like Atlanta, Athens, right. Columbus. But on the other hand, Brian Kemp and the Republican Party were able to juice turnout in rural counties and small towns. How is this possible at the same time that the turnout is being increased in these deeply divided, partisan divide counties?
Well, so I'll give you two answers. Number one, we still don't have really good turnout.
I think it was 62%.
I mean, it could be. You'd like it to be a lot higher. You'd like everyone
to
vote, right?
Right.
And frankly, I support making it easier for people to vote. I also support changes in the law that make it more secure and that make it more likely than the person who's voting is the voter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Secondly, our state is going to become more urban, not less urban.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to require the Republican Party to do a better job of reaching out to urban Georgia.
Is the current party, Republican Party, so disposed currently to do that?
No,
or capable of doing that?
I think there's an acknowledgement that needs to occur. But once again, the party that has the better get out the vote will accomplish the task.
So what is it, do you think, you mentioned voter security and that, or voter fraud, voting security, voting access, that sort of panoply of issues consumed the 2018 election,
Mm-hmm.
Mainly from Stacey Abrams' camp, using that as an issue, stressing that as an issue. What is the current state of, and of course you were the Attorney General, not the Secretary of State, but what's your take on voter access and voting issues in Georgia? What's the problem? How can it be made better?
So first of all, I think a lot of the criticism of Brian Kemp was downright wrong. Because at the end of the day, it's the county boards of elections that are in charge of elections.
How many people do you think actually know?
Oh, very few.
Okay.
And incidentally, a lot of the counties where we apparently had significant problems were Democrat-run counties. So it's the Democrat Party attacking Brian Kemp for the actions of Democrat-run boards of election. Interesting concept. You know, you had the articles recently about the new Secretary of State doing another new investigation about 4,700 alleged absentee ballots in DeKalb County. That was all under the purview of the DeKalb Board of Elections, not the state. So the reality versus the perception is a huge issue. But I don't think whether you're Republican or Democrat, you have a strong opinion that you'd like a paper backup.
Right.
Okay. You'd like to be able to take with you a sheet of paper that confirms who you voted for. That's good government. Now keep in mind it was a Democrat Secretary of State when this current system was put in place. So let's not attack ours now, and frankly, let's not attack D's then. Let's just acknowledge that we need a better system now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure Kathy Cox was doing the best with what the technology had at the time, and I greatly respect Kathy Cox. So I think we are way too quick to make personal attacks where they're not appropriate. Kathy Cox deserves none. Brian Kemp doesn't deserve them. Let's solve the problem rather than just go after people for the heck of it. We need a paper backup. You know, there still hasn't been evidence of a single machine breached. But if you ask the public, they'll give you a different answer, once again, perception versus reality.
Mm-hmm.
But we deserve better, and hopefully the legislature provides that better this session.
Speaking of session, we're fast approaching the end of the first legislative the year of the biennial. What's your takeaway from Brian Kemp's first legislative session so far?
I think overall positive. I think he is trying very hard to work with the legislators, similar to Governor Deal. I think he's letting them play out their process a lot without trying to dictate where he thinks they should go. There are a couple matters such as the Medicaid waivers, which was his push, where he's been more deliberate. But I support the waivers. He's going for 2. I think that's the right policy at the current moment. So I think he's frankly, he's reached out to the mayor of Atlanta, which of course I agree with. So I think that he is having a strong start.
Since you brought up waivers, it got me thinking about the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
The Justice Department just announced that it believes the law in its entirety is unconstitutional. It's been an issue since spring 2010, as you well know. What's going to happen with the affordable?
Okay. Justice Roberts decided it was a tax issue in a 5-4 vote. Congress thereafter removed the tax issue. The Texas District Court ruled that since the tax law part had changed, the law was unconstitutional. It will clearly go to the U.S. Supreme Court. No one really knows what that vote will be. I think pundits often talk about Supreme Court votes, and often they're very wrong. I would like to think that somehow or another the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader of the Senate, and the President could get together and do what was right for the public and give us a much better system. My son was unemployed a couple months last year. Do not expect me to be saying glorious things about the Affordable Care Act. The premium was high, and the deductible was astounding. So yes, you get X number of services for free, well, in return for the premium.
Sure.
But when you're talking about needing to go to the hospital or get a CT, a $7,000 deductible is not helping anyone who isn't ultra rich. So I think that while it pays for a lot of maternity coverage, it pays for a lot of wellness coverage, the premiums and the deductibles were pathetic. So I do think there need to be significant changes for America to have a better health care system. And I would like to think that our country can do that. That should not be a partisan issue.
Looking ahead to 2020, just as we begin to wrap up, expectation is Georgia's going to be a battleground state based on the 2018 numbers and activity. The presidential election will be going on, as well as U.S. Senate seat currently held by Senator David Perdue. What's your anticipation for that election campaign?
I think they'll be close.
You think this is sort of the new normal, that Georgia is going to be the proverbial purple state?
Well, I'm not sure that 5 or 10 years out it will be the new normal. It's certainly the normal for the next several years. I still believe at the end of the day the candidates matter. My comment before about an Elizabeth Warren versus a Joe Biden, there's a lot more people in the middle that will vote for Joe Biden than Elizabeth Warren. That matters.
Is that true on the Republican side as well?
Well, when you have an incumbent president, that's less true. When you have an incumbent senator, that's less true. That's really more in an open race.
Do you expect anybody to run in a Republican primary against President Trump?
Maybe there's a 20% shot of that. If you ask me, will they be successful? Very much doubt that.
Right. Are you a believer that demographics are destiny in politics?
Well, it depends what you mean by demographics. Demographics are a lot broader than race.
Mm-hmm.
Age, sex, education, all play into it,
mm-hmm.
not just one demographic.
Right.
So, for instance, if you show me that more young people vote, that can make a significant effect on the outcome.
Well, is there, since you've already foreclosed a reentry into politics, that takes care of my last question.
No interest at all.
No,
people always say, well, you have it in your blood. Well, I don't. I didn't have it in my blood when I ran in the first place. I just wanted to improve the community, and frankly, I can improve the community without being elected. Would I ever perceive of serving on a board or authority or commission? Yes. Am I going to be on nonprofit boards? I am now.
Sure.
But I remember when someone would send you an email with capital letters, and that was unprofessional. Oh my God, compared to now? I mean, now people just see something and immediately respond with no research at all. And I think that's really scary for our democracy. I think that nothing should ever replace research.
Well, you'll get no argument from me as an archivist and a historian.
Right.
But how much of this, the knee-jerk reaction is to blame social media and Facebook and Twitter.
That's just a mechanism.
Right. Which was the point I was driving. You can go to any manuscript collection at the Russell Library, Senator Russell's mm-hmm. papers, mm-hmm. pick one, and there will always be files of mimeographed newsletters right. from real far out groups on pick the issue, mm-hmm. fluoridation in the water,
right. Familiar with that one.
Yes, and it seems the ideas have always been there, but the platform
is now different.
And the ability
it's
to
cheaper
disseminate
and
right.
easier.
The democratization of
right.
of communications, I suppose, which is entirely
right.
entirely other dissertation.
But there's a responsibility to actually do research before you repeat
mm-hmm.
what comes before your screen.
Well, with that, I thank you for your time.
My honor.
Thank you very much for participating in the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Thank you, Mr. Olens.
Thank you.